Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Ready to dive into another heavy one.
Always ready, always ready.
This time, we're looking at something that really, it's one of those things that it just makes you stop and think. You hear about this kind of stuff, wow, is this really still happening? Are we really still doing this?
It's a difficult subject to grapple with, for sure. There's a rawness to it.
Yeah, and it's not just the act itself. It's all the stuff around it, the
Yeah.
why, the how, the ripple effect.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the case we're going to discuss today really brings all of those elements to the forefront in a very stark way.
It does. It does. So we're looking at the recent execution of Brad Keith Sigmon. It happened at the Broad River Correctional Institution, which is in Columbia, South Carolina. And what really makes this case stand out, I think, is the method that was used.
Right, the firing squad.
The firing squad.
Yeah.
It's the first time in South Carolina's history that this method has been used for an execution. It's almost hard to believe, right? Like you think of the firing squad, and it feels like something out of like a history book.
Yeah, you sort of think we've moved beyond that as a society. But here we are.
Here we are. So March 7th, 2025, 6:08 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's the moment that this became part of South Carolina's story. And, for our deep dive today, we're going to be pulling a lot from an article that came out of InfoBay. They did a pretty in-depth report on this whole thing, Sigmund's last words, and, just the broader context of everything. So I guess to start, we have to go back, right? We have to go back to the crime itself.
Yeah, you have to understand what led to this point. It's a grim story. Back in April of 2001, Brad Keith Sigmon committed a double homicide. His victors were William David Lark, who was 62 at the time, and Gladys Lark, 59. They were actually the parents of his ex-girlfriend, Rebecca Barbaret.
It's such a brutal crime. I mean, the details, you read them and it's just hard to wrap your head around it. The article goes into, how they were attacked in their own home. Sigmon used a baseball bat, 9 blows to the head.
It's hard to imagine the sheer violence of that act. It's devastating.
Yeah, and after this, he was on the run for like 11 days. They finally caught him in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. So fast forward through the whole legal process. He ends up convicted on 2 counts of murder, 1 count of robbery. And for the murders, he receives the death penalty. And then for the robbery, a 30-year sentence on top of that.
Right. So that brings us up to last week, to the actual execution. And as we said, the use of the firing squad is what really makes this case stand out. It's only the second execution carried out in South Carolina this year. But this choice of method, it wasn't just a matter of procedure. There was a lot of controversy surrounding it.
Yeah, Sigmund's lawyer, Gerald Bo King, he tried to stop the execution from going forward. He actually went to the South Carolina Supreme Court, tried to get them to intervene. And his whole argument was that the firing squad was only being used because there were serious doubts about the lethal injection.
Right, like, was it effective? Was it going to be botched? Would it cause unnecessary suffering? These are huge questions.
And it's interesting, right? Because we've seen more and more of this, this questioning of lethal injection as this, like, quote unquote, humane method of execution.
Yeah, it's become a bigger and bigger issue. King even brought up, in another recent execution, Marion Bowman Jr., back on January 31st. He described it as, he said it was basically like Bowman drowned, that his lungs filled with blood and fluids.
Oh, God, that's just awful.
Yeah, it's a gruesome image. And King's point was that Sigmon didn't have enough information about the lethal injection protocols to even make an informed decision.
So, like, he couldn't really choose between the 2 options fairly.
Exactly. But of course, the state argued that by picking the firing squad, he basically waived any objections he might have had.
Oh, so it's like, well, you chose this, so you can't complain now.
Yeah, that was their stance. But it does make you think, right? Like, if the main option is potentially flawed and inhumane, does choosing a different option mean the state is off the hook? Like, does that make it okay?
It's a really complicated situation, isn't it? But in the midst of all this, this debate about the method Sigmon, he actually comes out with a really powerful message, a message that, kind of goes beyond the immediate circumstances.
Yeah, in his final words, he made a direct plea to abolish the death penalty.
And, it's one thing for, like, activists or people who are against the death penalty to say that, but for him, facing his own execution, it's really something.
It's definitely powerful. He said, quote, "I want my final statement to be a show of love and a call to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty." End quote.
It's like he's searching for some kind of redemption, some kind of reconciliation in his final moments. It's really moving.
Yeah. And he went on to explain his reasoning. He talked about how the jury, they used this eye for an eye idea, from the Old Testament to justify giving him the death penalty. And he said that at the time of his trial, he was too ignorant to even understand, how wrong that was.
So, he was basically saying he'd come to a different understanding, right? Like his views had evolved.
Exactly. He said that society now lives under the New Testament law, which to him meant moving away from that kind of strict, eye for an eye punishment. Maybe there's a different way.
It's a pretty powerful statement to make right before facing that ultimate consequence.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions too.
Yeah.
About how we interpret religious texts, how they play into our legal system, all of that.
Yeah. This guy, he committed these terrible, brutal acts, but in the end, he's calling for compassion, for a different approach. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and, while all this is happening, we have to remember that the death penalty is still legal in 27 U.S. states.
It's true. But we're also seeing, this growing movement to step back from it. You've got California, Pennsylvania, Oregon, Ohio. They've all got these moratoriums in place put there by their governors.
Right, so there's this tension. On the one hand, it's still legal in many places, but on the other hand, you've got this pushback, this questioning of whether it's really the right thing to do.
And then you've got public opinion, which is always a big factor in this. And, a Gallup poll from October of last year, they found that 53% of Americans are still in favor of the death penalty.
Which is interesting because if you look at the younger generations, like millennials and Gen Z, less than half of them support it.
So it does seem like things are shifting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years.
Yeah.
Will that translate into actual policy changes? Will we see more states moving away from the death penalty? It's hard to say.
For sure. But in the meantime, the executions, they keep happening. The InfoBay article, it even mentions the next one that's scheduled. David Leonard Wood in Texas, just a few days from now, March 13th.
Yeah.
And they're going to use lethal injection.
So yeah, the debate continues, the practice continues, and Sigmon's case, it really highlights just how complicated and contradictory all of this is. It forces us to think about what justice really means, what methods are acceptable, all of that.
It's a tough conversation, but it's one we need to have.
Absolutely.
Well, folks, that about wraps up our deep dive for today. We looked at this really unusual case, the execution of Brad Keith Sigmon, the first time South Carolina's used a firing squad, all the legal back and forth, the arguments over lethal injection, and then, of course, his final struggle, that powerful call to end the death penalty.
Yeah, and all of that is happening against this backdrop of shifting public opinion, states rethinking their stance on capital punishment. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But as always, we encourage you to keep thinking about it, to keep asking the tough questions. Like, how do our ideas about justice change over time? And what role should those changes play in our laws?
Those are the kind of questions that, they don't have easy answers, but they're the ones we need to wrestle with.
They are. So thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
I'll be back soon
with another one.
Until next time.
Take care, everyone.